Well, welcome back. I'm a little bit slow this week due to the flu. I hope you guys do not get it. It's a miserable thing. But in the meantime, let's see if we can go a little bit deeper in JavaScript and look at some details, specifically of the images that we're going to be working with this week. We need to look or review and look at our simple variable types. You should be familiar with strings and numbers and booleans at this point. You just use the var keyword, give it a name, and throw something or assign something to it. It's like a bucket. It can hold anything you want it to. As you turn around and start getting more sophisticated, there is an official way of creating variables. It's overkill for simple variables, but you would say keyword var some number equal new number, and that would create a new number. But like I said, it's overkill for these simple ones. When we get into more complex variable types, however, it becomes necessary in a lot of cases to use this long notation. It gives some hints to what's to come to JavaScript. And with arrays and images, dates and times, and also objects, you can create or roll your own objects, which is very, very cool. So with these, you tend to use these longer forms, and this is just one way of doing it. I'll show you some shortcuts later on of creating arrays and images, dates and times, and objects as complex variable types. Remember, you can chain objects, properties, and methods using dot syntax, because if you have some object, you have dot some property, and if you recall, some property is just a variable that's assigned to that object. And some method is just a function that's assigned to an object. So properties are variables, methods are functions that are assigned to objects. So kind of let that sink in a little bit. Should be good to go. As we look at images, we have this construct, this object in JavaScript called document.images. And this object reflects all the images on a web page. So not only are all the images in a document packed into this one object, each image is also an object on its own. And you can refer to a single image in one of the following ways. You can look at it like an array that has a list of images that is referred to by its index or its number, because when you say document.images, it'll return just a list of all the images on a page. You refer to 0 or the first one, or any of them. You can also refer to it by its attribute property notation, which is basically document.images.SumImageProperty. Probably the more flexible way. So let's look at the ID attribute, because if you remember from CSS class, one way of assigning a unique identifier to any object on a page is to give it an ID, because you can only have one specific ID on a page. You can have as many IDs as you want as long as they're named uniquely. So ID equals anything. There'd only be one object with an ID of anything on the page. Classes are a different story, but IDs are unique per page. So we could say document.images anything in quotes and square brackets as an ID attribute and get at it that way. Now, it used to be, before CSS became popular about 5 years ago, that you use the name attribute instead of the ID. It was basically used for the same purpose, but it's very, very old school. You'll see it in code, you'll see it in books, you'll see it in examples when you Google things like image swap on the web, but it's very old school. IDs are the more modern way of doing things, and that's what we'll be using. So we'll talk later about the DOM, or the document object model, way of getting at an image object with an ID of anything. Just be aware the book mentions it a couple times. They don't explain it really well yet, but we're going to get there next week. Now, if you look at an HTML element, image ID equals anything, source equal whatever .gif. Let's suppose this code defines the third image on a page, and the following points to or references that image. Document.images 2 in square brackets. Remember, we start counting at 0. So 0, 1, 2. 2 is the third one. That's the array notation. You could also look at an ID property notation way, which is document.images anything in quotes and square brackets. That's the long form. It shows the chain. But document.anything in quotes and square brackets is kind of a shortcut. As you get more experience, you use lots of shortcuts. For our purposes in this beginning level course, I'll probably always use the long way. Feel free to use the shortcuts if you know them. And off we go here to one caveat. If you decide to use array notation, and as you add and subtract images to a page with JavaScript, your indexes are going to change. And just be prepared to change your indexes in your scripts as you add new images or delete images before and after existing ones, because they change. If you put an image between a new image between image 2 and 3, image 3 now becomes image 4, and you can figure the rest of that out. I highly recommend using the property notation. It's much easier. It's much more maintainable as far as code goes, but either one works. JavaScript also offers the standard document.images.length property, which holds the actual number of images on the page. For example, you got 10 images on a page, document.images.length evaluates to 10. So document.images9 reflects the last image because array indexes start from 0. We always count from 0, 1, 2, 3. So there we go. And this is really handy when we go and loop through the images in a document, say to add icons or adjust them or do whatever we want to with them in a for loop. As you look at HTML, the image tag, there's lots of different attributes: source, width, height, alt, ID. We're going to use them all. We're going to look at all of them. And if you look at this HTML, we have a source equal Lucky, the dog, an ID of Lucky, width, height, and alt. You always have an alt tag with images for screen readers, for those who are disabled. Now the CSS to point to this tag with an ID of Lucky is just image pound Lucky. Some people say hash instead of pound, but it's basically image pound Lucky. That's the way in CSS you would target that HTML tag, the unique identifier of Lucky. Now in JavaScript, we would say document.images Lucky in quotes and square brackets. Again, the quotes don't matter for single quotes or double quotes as long as you nest them properly. So document.images Lucky points to that ID, that specific tag in the HTML. Because document.images Lucky in quotes and square brackets is quite a lot to type, and I don't know about you, but as a programmer, efficiency and laziness, or a combination thereof, makes me and a lot of others take that value and throw it into a variable. So we can put document.images Lucky, that whole construct, as an object into a variable called myDog. It's a very common way of doing things, and you may have to think about it, you may have to work with it and type with it to get used to that, but take that construct, that dot syntax that refers to an object, throw it in a variable, and it makes life so much easier. For example, we have the same code. We throw document.images Lucky into a variable myDog. It's already been declared, so I didn't declare it here. We declared it on the previous slide. And you could say myDog.source and assign a value to the source. We could take myDog.alt and assign an alt tag to it. Or you could create your own attributes, or your own properties, I guess is the proper way of saying that. Your own properties. It's a very powerful thing. Even with predefined objects in JavaScript, you can create your own properties and methods. We're going to do that in our code, in our exercise this week. So kind of get used to it. For dogs, you could have a born on date. You could have all sorts of properties for any object. You just have to make them up. So remember, you can create your own properties for objects. Very cool. So let's go do some code.